History is often written as a monologue of great men. In the story of the Renaissance, we are taught to look at the bankers, the popes, and the artists, men with names like Cosimo, Lorenzo, and Michelangelo. We see the marble statues and the heavy fortress palaces of Florence as monuments to the masculine ambition. But behind the gilded doors of the Palazzo Medici, a different kind of power was being forged. The House of Medici did not survive on ledger books and mercenary armies alone. It survived because of its women. While the men were the public faces of the dynasty, the Medici women were the strategic anchors, the diplomatic geniuses, and the cultural architects. From the counting houses of Florence to the throne rooms of the Louvre, they traded the merchant's pen for the sovereign's sceptre. Hello, I am Dr. Amy Boyington, and today we step out of the shadows of the great men to meet the real designers of the Medici legacy. This is the story of the women who ruled the Renaissance and later. To understand the Medici family, we must start with a partnership. In the early 1400s, the Medici family were wealthy, but they were new money, viewed with suspicion by the ancient Florentine aristocracy. When Cosimo de' Medici, the man history calls the father of the fatherland, sought to solidify his family's status, he looked for ancient prestige. He found it in Contessina de' Bardi. Contessina came from one of the oldest and most respected banking families in Europe. Though the Bardi Bank had famously collapsed after lending to the English crown, their name still carried a weight that the Medici lacked. Her marriage to Cosimo in 1415 was that crucial bridge that allowed the Medici to cross from mere merchants to the ruling elite. Contessina was the definition of soft power. While Cosimo was often away on diplomatic missions or navigating the treacherous waters of Florentine politics, it was Contessina who managed the sprawling Medici household and the family's vast country estates. She was known for a formidable frugality and a sharp, no-nonsense political instinct. In 1433, when Cosimo was arrested by his rivals and faced execution, Contessina didn't panic. She worked the back channels of Florentine society, leveraging her Bardi connections to ensure his sentence was commuted to exile rather than death. During the years of exile, she was the one who kept the family's flame alive in Florence, ensuring that when the Medici returned, they didn't just return as citizens, they returned as its masters. We often credit Cosimo with the golden age of Florence, but the ledgers of the Medici Bank tell a more nuanced story. Contessina was the family's first great silent curator. She understood a fundamental truth of the 15th century. For a family of bankers, patronage was a moral shield. By funding religious art, the family could deflect accusations of usury, the sin of charging interest on loans, which the church technically forbade. We must remember that these women were using their own money. Under Florentine law, a Medici bride's dowry remained her legal property in many respects. Contessina used these funds to establish hospitals, decorate altars, and support convents. She was a primary patron of the convent of San Marco. While Cosimo paid for the architecture, it was Contessina who maintained the personal relationships with the friars and commissioned the intimate devotional works for the family's private spaces. She was also a keen supporter of the sculptor Donatello. It is often overlooked that his famous bronze David, the first freestanding nude statue since antiquity, stood in the courtyard of her home while she ran the daily operations of the dynasty. Contessina didn't just tolerate the avant-garde, she nurtured the environment that made it possible. If Contessina was the foundation, Lucrezia Tornabuoni was the intellect that elevated the Medici to the stars. Married to Cosimo's son, Piero the Gouty, Lucrezia was perhaps the most brilliant woman of the 15th century. Because her husband was frequently bedridden by illness, gout, Lucrezia became the de facto head of state. Lucrezia was a celebrated poet in her own right, but her literary patronage was strategic. She was the primary sponsor of Luigi Pulci, the poet who wrote Morgante. By supporting vernacular poetry, poetry written in the common Italian tongue rather than Latin, she helped make the Medici the champions of the people's culture. She was also a significant patron of the painter Filippo Lippi, often intervening to protect the rebellious artist from church authorities. When you look at the ethereal, lyrical Madonnas of the mid-1400s, you're looking at an aesthetic favoured and funded by Lucrezia. But Lucrezia was also more than a poet. She was a mogul. She purchased and renovated sulphur baths and thermal springs at Banjo and Morba, turning them into a profitable resort. She used the profits to provide dowries for poor girls, ensuring social stability in Florence, a soft power strategy that her son Lorenzo the Magnificent would eventually perfect. Lucrezia understood that for the Medici to truly rule, they needed to move beyond the borders of Florence. In 1469, she travelled to Rome alone to personally inspect and secure a bride for Lorenzo, the notable Clarice Orsini. This marriage connected the Medici to the Roman aristocracy and the papacy. Without Lucrezia's diplomatic footwork, the Medici would never have produced their first popes, namely Leo X and Clement VII. By the early 16th century, the Medici were no longer just Florentine bankers, they were European royalty. Enter Catherine de' Medici, later known in France as Catherine de' Medici, arguably the most slandered woman in European history. Born in 1519, Catherine was orphaned within weeks of her birth and used as a political pawn. In 1533, she was shipped to France to marry Henry the Duke of Orleans. Catherine was a woman of immense resilience. For 10 years, she failed to produce an heir, living under the constant threat of being sent back to Italy. She endured the public humiliation of her husband's lifelong devotion to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. The legend of Catherine as a poisoner began early on with her arrival in France, accompanied by her personal perfumer, Renato Bianco. Rumours claimed that she used poison gloves to eliminate her rivals, most notably Joan d'Arbre. While modern science suggests these deaths were natural, the myth of the Black Queen persisted because it was a convenient way for the French nobility to demonise a powerful foreign woman using Italian science. When Henry died in 1559, Catherine finally stepped into the light. As the mother of 3 successive weak kings, she ruled France as regent for nearly 30 years, during the bloodiest religious wars in its history. She allegedly introduced the fork, she introduced the ballet, and the concept of the grand magnificence to the French court, using art and festivals to project power where she lacked physical force. A generation later, the Medici returned to the French throne in the form of Marie de' Medici. If Catherine was the queen of survival, Marie was the queen of splendor. Married to Henry IV in 1600, Marie's dowry was the largest in history. It literally paid off the French crown's debts. Marie understood the power of image better than almost anyone. She commissioned Peter Paul Rubens to paint a cycle of 24 massive canvases, depicting her life as a series of divine triumphs. This was the Medici strategy on an even grander scale. She built the Luxembourg Palace in Paris to remind her of the Pitti Palace in Florence. However, Marie lacked the subtlety of her predecessors. Her stubbornness led to a bitter public war with her own son, Louis XIII, and Cardinal Richelieu. After Henry IV's assassination in 1610, Marie became regent. She loved the power of the throne so much that she refused to hand it over to her son when he came of age. She viewed herself as the perpetual mother of France. Her refusal to stop mothering her adult son led to a literal civil war. Louis XIII eventually had her mother's closest advisors executed and forced Marie into exile. Marie eventually died in exile, but she was the woman who turned the French court into the centre of European artistic life, a direct inheritance from the streets of Florence. By the late 17th century, the Medici grand design of marrying into French royalty backfired in the form of Marguerite Louise d'Orléans. A cousin of Louis XIV, she was forced to marry Cosimo III in 1661. If the earlier Medici women were anchors, Marguerite Louise was a storm. Marguerite Louise hated Florence. She found the Medici court sombre, pious, and suffocatingly provincial, compared to the sun-drenched decadence of Versailles. Her husband, Cosimo III, was a religious fanatic, obsessed with morality laws and etiquette. The result was one of the most famously miserable marriages in European history. For Marguerite Louise, motherhood was a bargaining chip. She eventually provided 3 children, Ferdinando, Anna Maria Luisa, and Juan Gastoni, but she did so under protest. She famously told her husband that she would rather go to the devil than stay in Florence. And then, in an unprecedented move for a woman of her rank, she eventually left the Grand Duchy entirely in 1675, retreating to a convent in France. Historians often trace the eventual collapse of the Medici line to this broken home. Her sons grew up resentful and dissolute, and her daughter, Anna Maria Luisa, grew up with a fierce, almost offensive devotion to the family name, perhaps to compensate for the mother who had so publicly rejected it. This brings us back to the woman who had to pick up the pieces of her mother's rebellion. Anna Maria Luisa was the product of that broken home, yet she became the family's greatest protector. Having seen her mother flee and her brothers succumb to despair, she realised that she was the only one left to care for the family soul. Born in 1667, Anna grew up in a palace defined by her mother's absence and her father's religious gloom. She was the middle child of the disaster marriage, and she spent her life watching the male line of her family, her brothers Ferdinando and Gian Gastoni, slowly succumb to the weight of their own dynastic failure. In 1691, she was married to Joan Wilhelm, Elector Palatinate. It was a grand strategic match that took her away from the stifling atmosphere of Florence to the vibrant court of Dusseldorf. There, she blossomed into a formidable patron of the arts, just as her ancestors had. But even in Germany, the shadow of the Medici followed her. She remained childless, the same biological curse that was currently strangling her brothers back in Italy. When her husband died in 1716, Anna returned to a Florence that was a ghost of its former self. Her father, Cosimo III, was desperate. He knew that without a male heir, the great powers of Europe, Austria, France, and Spain, were already hovering like vultures, ready to annex Tuscany and treat the Medici treasures as war prizes. He attempted to change the law to allow Anna to succeed him as Grand Duchess, but the European powers laughed. To them, she was a woman whose time had passed. By the time her younger brother died, the Medici rule was officially over. The crown of Tuscany was handed over to the House of Lorraine. Most people in her position would have retreated into a quiet, bitter retirement, but Anna possessed the Medici brain, that rare blend of legal cunning and cultural foresight. She realised that while she couldn't keep the throne, she still owned all the stuff. And so on October the 31st, 1737, she sat down with the new Lorraine rulers and forced them to sign the Family Pact. It is one of the most significant legal documents in the history of Western civilization. In it, she bequeathed the entire massive collection of Medici art, the Botticellis, the Raphaels, the Leonardos, and the jewels, to the state of Tuscany. She added one ironclad clause that nothing shall ever be removed from the capital or from the territories of the Grand Duchy, and that these things are for the benefit of the public and to attract the curiosity of foreigners. Anna Maria Luisa never had children, but in that moment she became the mother of modern Florence. She knew that without its art, Florence was just another provincial city. By tying the art to the soil, she ensured that the Medici name would be spoken as long as there were tourists in the streets and scholars in the galleries. She spent her final years living in a wing of the Pitti Palace, listening to the new Lorraine rulers move into her family's bedrooms. She died in 1743 during a violent storm, the kind of storm that had greeted her birth. When she was buried in the Basilica of San Lorenzo, she was the last to be laid in the family crypt. The House of Medici ended not with a bang, but with a signature. From Contessini's iron grip on the household to Lucrezia's business empire, and from Catherine's blood-soaked survival to Anna Maria Luisa's final gift. The story of the Medici is a story of female resilience. They were the diplomats, the scholars, and the queens. They were not just Medici wives, they were the Medici. So the next time you look at a Renaissance masterpiece or walk around the streets of Florence, don't just look for the man who paid for it, look for the woman who made it possible. Thank you so much. I am Dr. Amy Boyington. If you've enjoyed this, please do like, comment, and subscribe.